whether that would be a breach of UEFA's and FIFA's guidelines. So there's no easy solution. There's no magic bullet here.
Welcome, everybody. Firstly, I'd really like to thank our guest today, Aaryaman, who will be discussing the independent regulator. I'm going to bring him on now to discuss his background. Everything that's going on now in the world of football governance it's at a pinnacle moment, really. And there's very few people in the industry who have the level of research and level of knowledge on the subject area as much as this man today. So I'd like to welcome Aaryaman.
Thank you, Josh. It's a very kind introduction, very flattering. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So just to give everyone a bit of a background on sort of who you are, what you do, how did you get involved in the football industry to begin with?
Yeah, so my name's Aaryaman Banerji. I'm the football policy lead at Civitas. Now, Civitas are an independent political think tank based out of Westminster. They look to instruct government policy, and by independent, what that means is we don't take money from any political party or party affiliated individual or organization. So Civitas have been looking at the football regulator and the changes in the football industry and the governance of the football industry for a while. In that capacity, I've published two, I think, quite long reports, quite extensive, some would argue too long, on changes in regulation. The first, Governing the Beautiful Game, the Future of Football and Civil Society, followed on from the fan-led review and really looked at that document and the effectiveness of it and the feasibility of it. And then A Whole New Ball Game, which came out just last month, looked at the football governance bill as it was proposed under the Conservative government, looked at the strengths and the weaknesses of that, and looked at the priorities that any new regulator should have when it is, and we think it will be now, introduced over the coming months. Before that, I studied for a year with FIFA. I did their MBA program with them. That was very eye-opening to be on the front line of an organization that is so often in the news for all sorts of reasons. And before that, I was a reporter for the Football Association. So that's sort of my background, how I got into this. Academically speaking, I have a history degree from Durham University, where my entire research was the political history of football. So I've been involved in the space for a little while now. I know compared to some people, I've only been here for 5 minutes, but it feels like a long time. And I am, as you say, there are a lot of very interesting changes coming up in the regulatory and governance sphere. And I'm very lucky to have been able to work on the front line of that. And I'm very interested in discussing in podcasts like this and in media appearances like this, how that's going to develop further. And I'm interested to see from a personal level how that plays out as well.
Brilliant. I think it's really interesting. I mean, to have the experience of sort of being involved in the FA, FIFA, all these sort of, being centralized around governance. Obviously, my background's slightly similar in terms of being involved in financial regulation, enforcing financial regulation for the 72 member clubs of the EFL. I think when you work on the inside of these big corporate, conglomerates that sort of have this level of control over the industry, it's really interesting to see how sort of both internal politics plays out within the building, but also the interactions between all the stakeholders and the sort of the level of influence different stakeholders have, different individuals has, and how that ultimately shapes the way in which the ecosystem runs. So that sort of brings me on to the next question in terms of why now? Why do we think it's all come to a head right now? I mean, the obvious answer that sort of sticks in everyone's mind is sort of like the European Super League. But are there any other external factors that you think are sort of driving this change right now?
Yeah, so there are a couple, and you've mentioned the sort of big one, Josh, which was the attempted creation of the European Super League in 2021. Was really it was an alarm. I like to describe it as an alarm bell that rung loud enough that it got heard in Westminster and Whitehall. It was a wake-up call to the disillusionment and the gap between club hierarchies and fans and the direction of the football industry was taking. So there was that, but also you had that supplemented, and this had been bubbling under for a number of years by 2021 by the increasing slew of administrations, insolvencies, and to a lesser extent liquidations amongst football clubs. Macclesfield Town, people talk about Bury. Technically, I don't think that was a liquidation; that was an expulsion from the football league. But people were growing increasingly concerned at a number of administrations amongst football clubs and a number of insolvencies, 55 clubs going insolvent between the start of the 21st century and present day. Going into administration. And that's, you could argue that's the free market, and the taxpayer shouldn't have to prop that sort of industry up, and they're not under the regulator. But where the difficulty comes is when those football clubs become community assets and are real cornerstones of people's life, real cornerstones of British heritage. And so there's a real dichotomy there where you have these items of heritage that are increasingly endangered by being within a culture that, let's be honest, is somewhat self-perpetuated, but which leaves them in a precarious position. And the individuals who suffer at the end of it are the fans, and also the employees in the local community, the businesses that are kept on by that club. You have to remember that the Premier League indirectly supports 100,000 jobs through its economic activities. That's something that filters down as well, of course, through the EFL and National League, and that becomes endangered as well. And so you have those two things that really played into the fact that the government instigated the fan-led review of English football, led by Tracy Crouch. She made her findings, the key one of which was the independent regulator. And the third factor that perhaps, and that's related to this point, that you can perhaps argue, and this is the cynic in me speaking, instigated this reform, was that when people can see that their community assets are endangered, it is quite an easy political win to say that we are going to do something about that. I'm not sure the extent to which the inner workings of the Conservative government at the time had that in their minds, but I would not be surprised if that was also a contributing factor.
Yes, I mean, at the time when it was all going off, obviously I was still an employee at the EFL, and our initial take on it was unfortunately quite cynical. I felt like because obviously as the EFL, we were making steps forward in terms of we'd launched the club financial reporting unit. So we'd built a bigger team to really focus on financial regulations, and we were trying to focus on tightening the individual definitions to make sure there was less. I think loopholes is the wrong word, because essentially it's just you play to the rules that are there. It's almost like, for me, there's an offside rule, but if you time your run in time and you bend your run and you're getting behind anyway and score, that you haven't, you haven't broken the rules. You've just timed your run well. And I think it's the same. You can have that sort of approach with financial regulation, but it's a case of, you can make it more difficult and how the sort of the rules of what the linesman has control of. I'm trying to use a parity that people will understand, but in terms of the tightening of the rules makes a massive impact as to how the people play the game of football business. I think that's the point I was trying to make there.
But,
Go on.
No, I was just going to agree with you. I think Kieran Maguire said this recently. You say loophole, I say rule. It's just different ways of looking about things, and ultimately if you've got a flawed system of regulation in place, then I'm not sure how much there is wrong with attempting to use that to the advantage of your particular organization. So I think you're quite correct on that front, Josh. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also key. And as well, I feel like, as this becomes more important, the more sort of rules are navigated and people are trying to look for positions of how can they optimize their position due to what regulations are in place, it forces the likes of the Premier League and the EFL to continue to refine their regulations so they get the outcomes that they're trying to achieve with the regulations that they currently have. It's like there's a whole interpretation around sort of rule breaks, well, obviously like loophole maneuvers, if you like. And it's a case of, well, we were trying to do this. And it's just like, well, if that's the outcome that you're trying to achieve, then you need to readdress the regulations so it's clear and obvious, and they're sort of like by the rule book. If you follow these, that's the outcome. And if you don't, then it's going to be a breach. Like, it needs to be black and white. So yeah, in terms of how the independent regulator came around, the timing of it, like you say, it was all around COVID, as well as, there was a lot of sort of negativity surrounding sort of politics and stuff, especially as to some of the events that happened with sort of government officials. So there was a lot of negativity around the government at that time, and obviously with the news of the independent regulator and what they were trying to do, some people did interpret that as they were trying to sort of get an easy win with the public. So I completely understand that sentiment. But so what do we think? So we've got to a position now, obviously, with the reports that you've discussed, actually do agree. It doesn't really matter how we got here. We actually do agree that there is a place for an independent regulator in football, as someone that can make decisions that is good for the game rather than good for individual stakeholders, rather than everybody trying to look after themselves. And again, my position on this, and again, it's a case of the Premier League, the decisions that the Premier League make are going to look after Premier League clubs. And that's why, for an example, one issue that people are sort of widely discussing at the moment is the likes of parachute payments. And it's a case of the Premier League, their decisions on parachute payments make sense because they're going to look after their clubs, quote unquote. When they go down, they're going to get financial support, so it makes it easy for them. Their job as the Premier League is to look after the Premier League, and therefore I don't blame them. Although, like, in an ideal world, everyone should be looking after everyone. But realistically, when you're sort of responsible and you have to report back to stakeholders and you have to justify the decision making of the organization, they're going to want decisions that help them above everything else. And that's why an independent regulator that can make decisions that's actually, okay, short, or even like short term, this is going to be sort of a negative impact, but the longer term sustainability side of things, this will make the long term vision of the game far better. So it's really an interesting one. I think one of the main things that came around with the whole European Super League was the fact that it felt like to fans and a lot of people, even within the industry, it was sort of out of the blue. It sort of came from nowhere, in terms of, like, there was always rumblings behind the scenes of, like, the sort of disgruntled nature of the top 6 clubs, if you want to call them that. It's a case of now, like, where do you see the importance on transparency in sort of club operations? And also, if a new independent regulator comes in place, how will that then be transparent enough to really ensure that fans are in a position where they understand what's going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, I've got to say I'm not entirely in agreement with the fact that the European Super League came out of the blue. We'd sort of seen the Premier League fracture and the different motivations of different clubs across even the last 20, 30 years. I mean, when you have a situation whereby clubs who are perhaps slightly economically and financially grander want to take just exactly to an extent how the Premier League was formed as well, take a slightly bigger portion of the potential revenues of any competition. And you sort of saw that with Project Big Picture in 2020. You've seen rumblings of that through the if you look at the all-party parliamentary group's reports as early as 2011, 2009, there's clear friction between the motivations of clubs. And I think it all just sort of came to a head, not out of the blue, but as a sort of culmination of years worth of dissatisfaction, years worth of trying to reshape the regulations in favor of a small minority of clubs, came to a head with the European Super League. Now, your question about transparency is it's a very interesting one. I think the regulator should be in a place to promote a greater level of transparency amongst clubs, and that could come from a number of different avenues. Now, one we were discussing quite briefly before we started recording on this podcast was the owners and directors test. So that would allow the regulator to investigate owners who are not only coming in to the club, but critically who are already there and whose perhaps financial or personal position has got to a point whereby it is inadvisable for them to continue ownership of that club. Now, I'm going to caveat that by saying that's all very well and good, but there are severe legal difficulties with what happens next if it is an incumbent owner that is inadvisable. In terms of corporate law, my understanding is that you can't actually force someone to sell their shares. You can perhaps create an environment whereby it becomes pretty difficult for them to hold on to those shares, but you can't actually, there's nothing you can do to actually force them to sell their particular stake in the club. But I think from a purely transparency perspective, it is quite important. I think also the club licensing system that's proposed will ensure that clubs develop evenly across various areas. At the moment, we have a culture which incentivizes unsustainability. You get money down, particularly as an EFL club, but also as a Premier League club. And the one thing you want to, you're motivated by is either how quickly you can get promoted or how much money it's going to take to avoid relegation, and all the money goes into that side of the club, and it ignores the fact that the club is actually a community asset. Now, if you look at the amount of money that comes in comparison to some of the more holistic development of clubs, it's pretty shambolic. The example I've used in the latest report is the disability access at many clubs, which is still very much below par. I think the statistic was 1/3 of disabled fans are still put off from going to a football match because they fear a lack of adequate facilities. And so that's something, if you look at the amount of money clubs have access to, is clearly not, and the amount of money clubs spend on things like left backs and player wages, it's clearly not a sustainable way of development. And so in terms of transparency, clubs will be almost forced by the club licensing system to spend in an even and a holistic way, which is made clear to the fan, so they know exactly sort of where that money needs to go, how that money can be spent. And that sort of brings me on to the final point with regard to your question, which is fan engagement. Now, fan engagement is often a slightly sort of nebulous concept. What exactly does fan engagement mean? Well, one of the things that fan engagement definitely does mean is a good communication between the club and the fan. And I think one of the key things that we've advised in the report is that fan engagement become a stipulation to include as part of the corporate governance report submitted by clubs to the regulator every year. And I think that's something that will promote transparency. And also, I think the other word to use is accountability, to promote accountability, so you can say that this is where this club is at with regards to fan engagement. This is perhaps clubs that need to improve. These are the trends that we're seeing, and that promotes a culture whereby communication between fans and clubs is key, and the regulator can hold clubs accountable to that.
I mean, absolutely. I think the one thing that's really important, I mean, in terms of the fan engagement point, it's a case of it's both ways. And I think so. I've been recently speaking with a club in which have recently appointed a fan engagement officer. And I think when I discussed with their fan base and their supporters trust about what does this role look like and what does it mean, and they were talking about, okay, we had certain issues on the first game of the season where like the toilets weren't working and the seats weren't clean and daft things like this, and they were just like, well, how does this work? And it's a case of having a representation that acts as the pillar of communication between the club and the board. It raises the importance of those issues and those sort of match day experience points to the board. Obviously, there's wider points that we're talking about today in terms of like how the club's being run on a business point of view, but having the communication pathway of this is these are our concerns as a match day fan. This is my concern when I turn up to the ground and I can't access the disabled toilets, or as a disabled fan I can't even turn up to the game because there isn't enough disabled access support and there isn't enough guidance for me as to how I get around the ground. Having those concerns report to the board from a fan experience point of view, from the fans perspective, but also where do the board's decisions impact the future of the football club is really key. And again, building on your point in terms about sort of investment and like money spent on left backs, I think was a great point, because fullbacks aren't real footballers in my point of view, but that's a different discussion.
That is the most controversial opinion on this podcast.
As a CDM who occasionally filled in at right back's so easy. I'm sorry, you're not a real footballer, but here you go. That's the clip. But no, my point is on that is it's about where money is invested in terms of the short-term and long-term development. So you take £1 million and you invest it into your football club directly into pitch performance, you'll see, hopefully, if you sign the right player, and that's a whole different discussion, but if you sign the right player, you'll see short-term gain right on the pitch. Mm-hmm. But if you take that £1 million and invest it into building better infrastructure for fans, like a fan experience park, or upgrading your hospitality suites and other areas, that money can then generate revenue for tens, hundreds, well, not hundreds of years to come, but tens of years to come, because you've now got greater facilities that can generate revenue on the long term rather than investing money on short-term performance. And I think this is the whole thing. And this is the problem with football, is in terms of it is a short-term game. At the end of the day, you're here to win football matches, and you need to win the next game. And obviously, again, this comes with sort of like, we could have a wider discussion here around sort of distribution, because I know that's sort of an interesting point where a lot of people would like to see distribution be handled, or the independent regulator have influence over distribution, because they know I have to invest short term. Because if I don't, and say a Nottingham Forest get promoted into the Premier League, they felt like they had to completely rebuild their entire squad. I think they signed about 30 different players to rebuild their whole squad just to stay in the Premier League, because they know the impact of relegation on their finances. They know if I can keep and stay as a Premier League club, my finances are going to be far more secure than if I get relegated. And that obviously applies to all the divisions. I mean, the gap between the Championship and League One is massive, and again, League One, League Two. So where's your sort of thoughts on that? Do you think that the independent regulator will have enough influence in that area in terms of to actually influence financial distribution within football?
Yeah, well, this has been the sort of big question that's been asked since the introduction of the idea of an independent regulator. How much power will it have over redistribution? Now, at the moment, obviously, there is still a significant gap between the Premier League's position and the EFL's position with regards to redistribution. The EFL, the regulator has been given backstop powers in order to enforce that gap, to close that gap. If that means if there's no football solution that comes through, the regulator will be able to step in and sort of arbitrate on an agreement between the two organizations. Now, the hope is that there will still be some sort of agreement that comes through, but I think the regulator is in a good place, particularly if you look at the comments made by UEFA yesterday on independence and whether a too stronger influence over the redistribution of financial flow, given that the independent regulator is at the moment flowing from government, whether that would be a breach of UEFA's and FIFA's guidelines. So there's no easy solution. There's no magic bullet here. And I'm not sure the extent to which the regulator will be able to actively enforce a new deal. What I can say, and where the regulator can help, is if the worst case scenario happens and we're down the line and the Premier League and the EFL are still miles apart, there will be some power of arbitration given to the regulator, and that's really where it can step in and provide some sort of help in that area.
No, I think it's really key. I think it's really interesting because in terms of UEFA's rules and in terms of how do the independent regulators stay have an influence, but also stay within the guidelines of making sure it itself doesn't breach the regulations, which is quite an interesting scenario. I think it's a case of there are essentially the government do impose financial rules onto football clubs already. There are reporting rules in terms of small company or full company accounts, depending on the size of the football club. Okay, that's applied to wider industry, not just football industry, but is essentially a rule that football clubs have to do. You've also got everything in terms of around tax laws and everything like that. That's essentially a government financial regulation that football clubs have to follow. Although, again, it's not a specific regulations that just football clubs have to follow, but it shows that, it's not a case of the government have zero influence on how football clubs are run as businesses, because essentially they are still businesses. So if the independent regulator positions itself correctly and makes sure that these regulations are sort of similar how they've treated regulation across other industries, with sort of like the water industry or, banking and etc. So like, we'll take the banking example with sort of the FCA and sort of the level of sort of financial rigor and sort of regulations and the amount of stuff that they have to publish and report back to the government and all the rest of it is really high level. And to take something not to that extent possibly, but a similar sort of structure in terms of reporting, in terms of how in which ownership can happen and things like that. For me, I don't think that that's a position in which UEFA can massively restrict the government from doing, seeming, they are still sort of organizations running within this country. So I feel like it is a really interesting balance. They have to have those discussions and they have to take UEFA seriously on these matters, because I think the one thing which is certain is UEFA will make sure that there'll be a precedent that's set, because if this gets introduced to the English League, there's already been discussions at sort of like the European Court of Justice level that they might be looking to the lobbyist groups that are trying to bring a similar sort of thing across the whole of the EU. So this is going to start a trend for the industry if this does come in place. And the way in which that influences football is really key. So I do agree the way in which they play this out is really, really interesting. I think that then sort of brings us on to where do we actually think this will play out? So what does the next sort of, in your eyes, where do you see the next? I mean, is this going to be a slow burn? Is this do we see this as like a 5-10 year project that will slowly get introduced? Or will it be sort of like got what brought in with other sectors, sort of like a big bang is sort of like we've produced these regulations, they're going to be enforced in the next 12 months. You need to all get yourselves in line, and there's going to be sort of like a massive sort of overnight impact on the industry? Or how do you sort of see this being introduced in sort of in reality?
Yeah, so the plan from the government has always been to have the regulator in place by the start of the 2025-2026 season. Now, that is the aim, that is the ambition. Now, that's what we've already got a shadow regulator sort of forming itself. But if it's in place by the 2025-2026 season, I think given the sort of scale of the task, it's going to be years before it actually starts, not years, but there is going to be a gap before it actually can effectively start doing any regulating. It has to get a team in place. It's got to go through all the boring administration stuff. It's got to forge relationships with different stakeholders. So from a timeline perspective, that's how I see how I see it playing out. I think, look, I've been in favour of the regulator since I started producing work for Civitas. I think it was a potentially workable solution. I think there were other solutions available that could have worked, but I think one of the solutions that really can work is an independent regulator. Now, the way this regulator is currently being framed, the way it is being set out, I do have reservations over its effectiveness and actually how useful it's going to be in alleviating some of the challenges in the football industry. I think there can be a place for it, but I think we have to manage our expectations slightly. First of all, this is no magic bullet solution. The regulator is not going to come in and wash away all of the problems in football. Now, there are a couple of particular concerns for me that are pressing with regards to the effectiveness of the regulator. The first one is it's already coming into quite a crowded regulatory space. We've got the FA, we've got the individual bodies such as the PFA, we've got the Premier League, which is in charge of the Premier League clubs, and some might argue is in charge of quite a lot more than that. We've got the EFL, we've got the National League. So where is there a place for an independent regulator? What's its scope going to be? The scope has been outlined by DCMS, but one of the things that came through in the letter sent by UEFA's second in command, Theodoridis, is that they can't, the regulators should not, and this is something, by the way, that I've been arguing since pretty much the first page of Governing the Beautiful Game. The regulators should not impede on the role or the potential role of the FA. This is an organisation that should work collaboratively with the FA. This is an organisation that should even cede power to the FA in time. Now, the fact that that's not been stipulated and not been highlighted in the legislation is a little bit of a concern for me. The other concern is the budget of the regulator. Now, the regulator is being funded by levy, a staggered levy on clubs, which obviously will see the more financially illustrious clubs be charged more, and clubs sort of lower down towards the pyramid obviously have to pay substantially less. I think that's, quite a fair system. This is not something you could tax for, particularly in the current climate. You'd have a sort of riot on your hands. But so I think that system works in itself. But the issue with the regulator being on statutory footing is the budget that's currently looking like is being proposed, the budget that we have seen sort of outlined, is insufficient given the sums of money being washed around in the football industry. Now, the original figure that was published by by various news outlets is a £10 million a year budget. Now, that could obviously change. The regulator does have the power to levy as it sees fit, but the Premier League has spent £30 million last year alone in litigation against its own clubs. Now, this translates further down. We were discussing shortly before the podcast that the regulator has just put out a job advertisement for a head of legal. Now, that head of legal would be paid £75,000 a year, or as I like to describe it, 15 hours of Lord Panic's work. He's £5,000 an hour. This is not far off what a trainee solicitor would make, somebody who's actually not fully qualified as a lawyer. Yeah. And you do think that this is going to be quite problematic as things go forward. The regulator could be tied up or drowned in all sorts of legal difficulties. And the argument that can be made, on the other hand, is the regulator can levy clubs for more and more money as they see fit. But for me, that's in itself sort of quite problematic. So, for example, you have a scenario whereby a Premier League club with significant financial resources takes the regulator to court, and then what? The regulator just starts levying more and more money off the clubs, including the club that's taken it to court, and sort of fund its own legal fees. I don't think that's a particularly sensible or workable solution. I think actually they might get tied up in some sort of legal difficulty if they attempt that. But on the other hand, like I say, this is a workable solution, and there are really positive points that the regulator can enforce. And I think if the regulator is, first of all, successful, as the legislation is very strongly set out that it should be, in blocking a breakaway competition such as the European Super League, and that's a huge tick in anyone's book. Secondly, if the regulator can impose a sustainable system of club licensing, as we discussed earlier, to move away from this incentivization of unsustainability, I think that's a big tick, and I think that is something that is within its remit and within its scope as currently set out. And I think if it can also start a conversation about aspects like fan engagement as part of the corporate governance code, I think that's another big tick. The other idea that I very much like, which I think is long overdue in the football industry, is this State of the Game report. And this is a report published on a 3-year basis by the regulator that it does exactly what it says on the tin. It takes the temperature of the football industry, all the trends, all the different issues, and puts them into one sort of behemoth of a paper. I think that is something that is an excellent, that is a creative idea. The issue then again comes, I think, a piece of work like that will require substantial resources. It might be something even they need to outsource to an external company. But I think if that is made workable, then that's another big tick. So I think there are potential positives from the regulator. I just think we've got to manage our expectations for what it's going to do, and I think we've got to be very, very careful in relation to the sort of budget, in relation to its relationship with FIFA and UEFA, which is obviously something that's been called into question over the last couple of weeks. And I think the worst thing that can possibly happen now is everybody looks at this legislation and says everything is fine, everything is okay. No, there is still work that needs to be done, and if that work is done appropriately and maturely, I think there could be some positive outcomes from this as well.
Well, been on quite a journey there. We started off sounding relatively pessimistic, and by the end of it, we were relatively positive in terms of where we think it could do. I think the theme in which it's come across is until everything's sort of finalized to a certain extent, there's no clear measuring points of what we think success looks like for this independent regulator. And like you say, in terms of managing expectations, I think for a club never to see the administration ever again, I think is almost like a ridiculous expectation to put on the independent regulator, because I just don't think that's possible. I think where you've got business, again, people don't like speaking about football as business, but it is a business. And where there's business, there's risk. You can never have an industry that operates without risk. So I feel like wherever there's business operations, there is risk. And if things go wrong, then unfortunately, businesses do go out of business. But the warning signs are normally there to be seen. And I think, like you said, the biggest issue is there's a lot of warning signs flashing at the moment. And again, it's one of the reports that we haven't actually discussed today is a report that we worked on together, funnily enough, with the Benefactor model. And I think that's a really interesting thing, because we've now got an industry that is so reliant on sort of third-party funding in order to operate itself. Clubs find as soon as the owners, run out of funds and essentially cannot afford to operate the football clubs anymore, or simply would like to invest their money elsewhere, I think that's when issues form. And I think there are so many wider implications that affect this. So, for example, there is going to be, or has been, and I can't remember the timing of when things are being introduced, but changes to the tax law in America. I know you're thinking, how does a change in tax law in America have any impact on English football? But it massively does. So in terms of one of the reasons, again, which is, it's a strange concept for people to believe, but one of the reasons why football clubs are so investable is because they lose so much money. Mm-hmm. And I know that's a crazy thing to say out loud, but it's because if you've got a company where you're making hundreds of millions of pounds in profit every year, having a vehicle which allows you to essentially lose money and therefore pay less tax is very important. And also, it's not only that a football club loses money, which is obviously a negative, but is a positive in terms of the amount of tax someone would have to pay. It also is an industry that's seeing such amount of growth that even though they lose money year on year, the football club itself continues to grow. So it's a case of, you've got that juxtaposition of, okay, we're going to lose money, which is we need to do in order so we're not paying as much tax. But then also, when we cash out eventually, if we sell the club on in a better position, especially if we take a club from a lower division and move it up a couple of divisions, we can sell it on at a far greater value and therefore get our money back out at that point. So it's sort of, again, it's a really complex industry, and whatever position this independent regulator ends up taking up, it has to really be able to consider how, like you say, how it positions itself within all these other regulators and how it impacts, the whole transfer system. And then, you've also got UEFA, Premier League, and the EFL's regulations talking about in terms of like their financial regulations. So like PNS, SEMP, that sort of thing. It's very complex. And I think the government have taken on a challenge that I'm not certain they well, obviously, I assume they have, but I feel like the size of this challenge to get it right is mammoth. And like you say, without the appropriate budget, it's it's going to be deemed a failure, unfortunately. And I think that's what we can't see, because this is, like we say, it's once in a lifetime opportunity essentially to get this right. And I think, like you say, it can have a massively positive impact on the game, or very little impact at all, depending on how it positions itself. So it's really, really interesting. um just to finish up then, because also I am wary of time, is what do you see sort of like the biggest challenges, and also in order to get there, like what are the key things that the government need to get right? What needs to be, in terms of the process of the bill, getting the bill across, like what are the key steps that need to happen in between now and regulation, like a regulator up and running? Where do you see sort of like the key steps, and how do we move the industry forward? What do you think are the key sort of steps that the government need to get right?
Well, there are sort of three different areas that I think the government really has to look into. The first of which we've touched on already is the internal processes of the regulator, the independence of it, which has been questioned, I think, possibly correctly over the last couple of weeks. Is it going to? And there are two reasons independence are important. First of all, is for the UEFA and FIFA regulations. Second of all, is because independence allows the flexibility and the dynamism that currently doesn't exist within regulatory bodies in the generally within the English football ecosystem, and will actually allow it to be an effective regulator. Then you've got ideas such as budget. You've got how the regulator is going to be structured, what's the legal team, which is going to be very busy, what's the legal team going to look like in terms of your accountancy team. These are all sort of the administrative capacity that you need to have. So you need to get the internal configuration of the regulator spot on. Once you've got that, we need to understand the scope of its powers. Now, I'm sort of fairly comfortable with where the government is with it in this respect, particularly from a macro perspective. It's got quite a nice little remit, the regulator. I think from a micro perspective, there's still some work to be done in relation to not putting too much pressure on small to medium-sized businesses, which is what most football clubs are. So that I think needs to be refined a little bit. And then once you've got that, I think you need to tailor those powers so that they have maximum impact and are effective to the highest possible outcome. So, for example, the club licensing system. What constitutes a good club licensing system? What would that look like? Now, the bill, quite correctly, has not gone into too much detail about that. That's not really a job for the bill. That's a job for the regulator when it's established. But it is something that will have to be established. What does a good club licensing system look like? What is an appropriate method of sanction? What guidance can the regulator give? How can we tailor the remit that we've got to ensure that it has the best possible impact for key stakeholders across the industry? And that's the one thing we've got to remember. We've talked a lot about clubs, we've talked a lot about fans, but actually this regulator is in a difficult position in the sense that it's got a balancing act whereby it needs to service as well the current organisations like the FA, which should work collaboratively with the FA. It needs to appease FIFA and UEFA, which is something I think it risks overlooking and does overlook. It needs to appeal to a whole broad range of stakeholders in that regard. And I think being able to tailor its powers to be able to optimize that will be the third stage. So a combination of those three things, I think, are the next key stages that this regulator and the government, as it looks to enforce it, will have to outline going forward.
Brilliant. I think it's such an interesting subject. I mean, we could literally talk about this all day. And I mean, between us two, sometimes we literally do that.
Yes, we do. Yes.
But I'd just like to thank you for coming on today. Thank you for joining the Goalsys community. Just for those who don't know, what this podcast is slightly different to others. So the one thing that I've noticed through my research before bothering to launch this podcast is that loads of people really love to engage in podcasts. So what I learned, it's a really good way to sort of learn interesting things, keep on top of what's happening in industry. But one of the issues that I saw in the podcast world is like, you don't ever get to engage with the people involved. You never get to ask your questions. You never get to network with these people. And the football industry is such a close-knit industry. And, myself and Aaryaman can sort of definitely vouch for that, because, everybody knows each other. It's a really close family. And we wanted to build a community that allows you to sort of come inside, meet the people, ask your questions. So on the back of this, we'll also be having a live Q&A with Aaryaman, which will only be available for those inside the community. All questions will also need to be submitted in advance, so that we're not we can sort of filter out the questions and make sure that relevant questions are obviously being asked. But we really encourage you to sort of get involved. Anyone listening to this who wants to be able to put their own questions forward, network with ourselves, please do get involved. And yes, just thanks again for coming on, because it has been a really, really interesting discussion. And yeah, I hope everybody listening as well is getting value from today.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure, Josh. I'm always happy to come on and talk about these things. I often talk for too long, but no, thank you so much for having me on.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.